In this section, we want to talk about how to graph linear equations. We'll start that discussion off by looking at how to plot coordinate pairs, or plot points, on what we refer to as the Cartesian coordinate system. The Cartesian coordinate system is just a grid with horizontal and vertical directions that's composed of 4 quadrants starting with the upper right hand corner, which we refer to as the first quadrant, and then moving in counterclockwise order, we move to the second quadrant, the third quadrant, and the fourth quadrant. The coordinate system is also composed of 2 axes. The horizontal axis is usually denoted as the x-axis, and the vertical axis denoted as y. But depending on the problem and the variables we're considering, those can change. And the origin, which is the point 0, 0, located at the intersection of the x and y axes. Looking at each of these coordinates and knowing that we have one direction related to our x coordinates, one direction related to our y coordinates, we can start to notice the behavior of those values in our different quadrants. For instance, in quadrant 1, to find any point in that quadrant, we would have to head to the right of the origin. So we'd be looking at values where x is greater than 0, and we'd be moving up above the x-axis, so all of our y values would be greater than 0. As we move into the second quadrant, to find a point there, we would have to move to the left of the origin, meaning our x value would be negative, but we'd still be going up above the x-axis, meaning our y-coordinate will be positive. In the third quadrant, both our x-coordinate and our y-coordinate would be negative, since we're moving to the left of the origin and below the x-axis. In the fourth quadrant, we would again have our x-coordinate being positive, since we're heading to the right of the origin, and our y-coordinate would be negative, since our point would be somewhere below the x-axis. Now what we want to do in example 1 is plot a series of points and identify the quadrant in which they're found. We'll start off with the point 8, 10. Keep in mind, for a coordinate pair, it's always the x-coordinate that comes first in that pair and the y-coordinate that comes second. So to plot this point, we'll move in the along the x-axis to x equals 8, and then we'll move straight up from there until we're in line with y equals 10. So that's where our first point will be. We'll call this A, so we can refer back to it. For part B, we want to plot -1, 4. So we'll move -1 in the x direction, and then up 4 in the y direction to get our point B. Next, we'll plot -10, 0, meaning we'll head to -10 in the x direction and 0 in the y direction, so we don't move up or down, we just stay right on the axis there. And that gives us point C. For point D, we'll move 0 in the x direction and down 5 in the y direction to get point D. Next, we'll move 2 units to the left, or towards -2 in the x direction, and 3 units down in the y direction to get point E. And to get point F, we'll move 4 units in the x direction and down 8 units in the y direction. And that gives us each of our points plotted. Now we can talk about which quadrant these points are found in. We can do that by just looking at what we plotted, or by assessing what we know about the points and where x and y are positive and negative. For point A, we were in the first quadrant, which makes sense because both our x and y values were positive. For point B, our x value is negative, but our y value is positive, putting us in the second quadrant. We'll skip over C and D for a second and jump ahead to E, where we have -2, -3. Both values are negative, putting us in the third quadrant. And for point F, we have a positive x and a negative y, putting us in the fourth quadrant. If we look back at our graph, our coordinate system, we can see point C and point D don't land in any particular quadrant. They're on the boundary between two different quadrants. So we can't refer to their position in the same way. Instead, we'll just simply say that point C is on the x-axis and point D is on the y-axis.